I think this further demonstrates that Tesla is a joke at this point. Optimus is like little more than a tech demo. I think they're way behind. Let's see if they prove me wrong.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is a Reacts episode.
Hey, I'm Chris Starr.
I'm Ellie Hansen.
And I'm Yaniv Bernstein. Welcome to the Startup Podcast Reacts. Today we're going to talk about corporate espionage, two sponsors of the Startup Podcast suing each other and making outlandish claims about spies in each other's ranks. Next, we're going to talk about the state of AI competition, OpenAI wanting DeepSeek to be banned, and what it tells us about the state of global superpower geopolitics. After that, we're going to move on to the discussion of robotics. We've been talking about why 2025 is a year of robotics, and there are a number of incredible new developments there. Finally, in Trend Corner, we are going to discuss the latest AI gold rush, which is the race for your and your company's data. All that and more right after the break. Whether you're starting or scaling your company's security program, demonstrating top-notch security practices and establishing trust is more important than ever. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. And it gets even better. Just for TSP listeners, you can get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off. Okay, so the first topic we wanted to discuss today is a juicy one, and it's even juicier, guys, because it involves two previous sponsors of this very show, Deel and Rippling. So this is about corporate espionage. Over the last 24 hours at the time of recording, there was a story that broke where Rippling, the HR tech company, is suing Deel, another HR tech company, for corporate espionage. So what they allege is that Deel actually placed employees inside Rippling and used them to extract competitive intelligence from them. And this story has it all. They set up a honeypot and did a bunch of stuff to basically catch this person. Slack is basically the key bit of evidence where this person inside Rippling was searching for Deel dozens of times a day and extracting information, discussions about Deel, about competitive situations and so on. And I think it's fascinating. Both these companies are doing something pretty similar. They're both growing at a pretty similar pace, which is fast. I believe Rippling's valued at $13 billion and Deel at $12 billion. So it's neck and neck. And, you know, I just think it's a really interesting story. I thought maybe we could talk a little bit, folks, about the general question of corporate espionage, because actually another story also broke, which is that Flexport is accusing some of its former employees of stealing its source code and other IP to create a rival startup. And, you know, I think one question maybe, I know we've talked before about not worrying too much about people stealing your stuff when you're building a startup, because really you don't even have a right to exist yet. But at a certain point, that changes. So what are our takes on this?
Speaks a little bit to the kind of intense pressure from the market, VCs, stakeholders for, unrivaled hyper growth. It's sort of like win at all costs, including breaking the law and stealing data, maybe. Corporate espionage has been around for forever, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's now a high stakes game of Slack search, which, Slack makes it a lot easier, especially if you're getting notifications about big new clients and clients churning and what have you. And there's a lot of pressure on these companies, especially in these hype cycles, to win the day. In the end of the day, it's going to be more costly for them than any advantage they would have gotten, because it's just going to crater their brand and crater their leadership.
To me, it really speaks to is the fact that these tools that we use every single day are really the medium is actually, such a part of the way that these companies are built now. And, they're not these employees are not going and having a backroom conversation, debriefing at the end of the day on what they talked about. They're just going on Slack. And you have to know that these communications in the medium that you're using, this information is, I don't want to say it's being tracked, but it is being tracked, like there's history. It's, you can see all of these things. And I think it is pretty interesting to see like Slack DMs as evidence in a corporate lawsuit is definitely wild. It, kind of feels like a scene of a modern tech succession scene or something like that. It's pretty shocking to think that a company would actually place a mole, if that is the case, at another company, because, those types of things, you just can't imagine that wouldn't get found out with this medium. That's kind of my point. It's not like these things are not trackable or traceable. You can actually go and see what was said. And I wonder, if that's that kind of intent to go and do it, you're either going in with eyes wide open where you're like, okay, if we get caught, we still got all of this information, or to think that you actually wouldn't get caught is pretty shocking.
Funny you should say that, Ellie, because ultimately I actually wonder why you think that it's impossible to imagine that you couldn't get caught. What this makes me wonder is, for every case that is discovered, how many cases of corporate espionage have not been discovered and flown right under the radar? Most companies I've worked for, maybe they log all this stuff, but they don't have the resources to actually look through all these logs and alert for suspicious behavior. And so I actually wonder if corporate espionage is much more widespread than one might imagine.
I'm sure that it might be. I wouldn't say it probably is. It very well could be. But I think the thing is, about the technologies that we have today, AI allows you to process massive amounts of unstructured data in a way that we've never been able to do before, and at a rate that we've never been able to do before. I don't know if those kinds of tools were used in actually uncovering this. It's hard to know. There's pretty interesting timing, in terms of finding it out. But because that is true, that it's not like, maybe it's not like those things weren't happening, but maybe someone wasn't looking for it, or we didn't have the resources, to be actually, scraping through. But AI doesn't sleep. AI constantly has the resources to do that. So it is pretty interesting. And I think it is something that we'll probably talk about later in the show, is sort of how employees actually feel about their messages being used, or tracked or read, or, by models and things like that.
This speaks to the continued undermining of the Silicon Valley culture. Slack is a tool that kind of represents and embodies this idea of open communication, full transparency, peer-to-peer, break down silos, casualness. And then it was used against the company to be able to mine data about competitors and CRM events and so on. The liberalism and optimism of Silicon Valley tech, that we're here to change the world, make a dent in the universe, we're the good guys, seems to be getting diminished in recent, let's call it months, if not years. And it's now more about win, dominate, crush, destroy, take over the country. I know certainly I've noticed a palpable shift in this cycle in Silicon Valley from being more about social and authenticity and open, which is like the last cycle of social tools, to now it's like pound Jolt Cola until until 2 a.m. and write algorithms. Like there's no time to fuck around. And so it does speak to this kind of erosion of the idealism of some of these cultural trends, I think.
I don't know if I'd agree with you on maybe on the erosion part, but I think there's always been a tension between the underlying competitive nature of Silicon Valley and the perhaps performative, perhaps integral and true, but social liberalism and do-gooder ethos. And I think that the reality is that when you're building these types of massive tech companies, there is a ruthless competitive nature. And we've seen it in so many of the organizations that have come out of Silicon Valley and elsewhere in the world. And I don't think that's new. It might just be coming up in different ways today.
Well, Google's not having any more meetings about safe spaces, is what I'm saying. They're no longer tolerating even the performative stuff, right? There's the leaders are no longer pretending to be, or I don't know if they were pretending, but they're no longer like Democratic donors. They're now on stage with Trump. There's no and now this sort of openness is being weaponized. Now, you can jump in any chat and you can talk to anyone, and now it's like maybe we don't want everybody seeing everything.
Well, that to me is actually the interesting thing that I'd love to discuss a bit, which is that the culture of tech companies, and one that I strongly espouse, is one of internal openness, right? That the way you build a fast-growing tech company, the way you stay aligned, the way you share context, is by having things open by default, so that employees can understand the broad context of what's happening and move faster. Now, I think the question here is, does the risk of corporate espionage or even state espionage potentially obviate that? Does that mean we should start locking things down more as founders? Or do we say, I guess maybe the question I would ask is, how much has Rippling really been hurt by this? Would they have done things differently? Will they be doing things differently in the future, knowing now that there are competitors who are trying to steal information from them?
That's a good concrete example. Like I work at a startup, advise a startup that has Microsoft tools, and it's maddening, absolutely maddening, because it's all closed by default. It's all, corporate closed policy. And so to share a document, the links expire, and you have to recopy them, and you have to set certain settings, and everything is just a nightmare. And Google is open by default. Google Docs, Google Workspaces, right? And so it borrows more from that Silicon Valley kind of mind space. So yeah, you're this kind of default open of the culture, of the tools, of the data policies is what I'm referring to. And it feels like there is a number of like death by a thousand cuts for this kind of these default cultural positions that are eroding away. And this feels like a good excuse to erode this openness, cultural value.
I think that the inherent values within individuals still exist just because there's pressure from outside forces that is right now in this particular moment making companies like Google not have those open space conversations. We know that that's coming from outside pressure. But I think that the ambition and the drive of the values of the individuals inside the organization are probably still the same. And I'm sure there are many people who do care about it, and I'm sure there are many people who don't. And that's fine. People have different values that drive them. I don't think, Yanav, to your question about Rippling, two employees stole our IP and started a competitor is not an outside unusual story. Like, this is not something that this is not unheard of, and this is not a new story. I think that if you're a founder, at what point do you protect IP versus accept that talent moves fast is a pretty classic question. And I think the idea, so thus far, there's different ways to go about it. Some try to protect it. Some, take that closed systems approach and the maybe combative approach. And others are like, cool, we're going to innovate faster. We're going to keep moving, and we're going to be open about it. And I think that these are reflective of different mindsets of individuals and there's examples on both sides of success, right? And that's okay. I do think that the open nature of building internally is really critical. I believe that that's really critical to success in organizations, and especially as an early stage investor. And I also think that as you grow as a company, today, employees are under, I believe that people are under no illusion. Like, there's Slack messages and their information that they're discussing internally in the organization. You have to understand and know that that's the data and belongs to the company, right? And I think that if you are having open conversations internally, it should be productive stuff. It should be good stuff. It should be ethical stuff. And unless you are acting unethical, and unless you are doing something wrong, you should have nothing to worry about. Personally, that's what I believe.
So maybe this is a good bridge to our next topic, which is that OpenAI has called for DeepSeek to be banned because it's state-sponsored and state-controlled, right? So now we're moving from corporate espionage to government espionage. And it reminds me when we were talking about all of this Deel and Rippling stuff, back when I was at Google, there were at least a couple of incidents where it was clear that there were employees, engineers at Google who were acting as assets for the Chinese government and who were actually fired for that. So I think this world of espionage and, the question of what state actors are doing when it comes now to technology that is so powerful, to technology that really is important at the governmental level. What does geopolitics play into this? And when OpenAI is calling for DeepSeek to be banned because it's state-sponsored and state-controlled, are they, as certain people like to say, calling balls and strikes and just pointing out the obvious? Or is there another motivation? What do we think?
It's a bold move. I think that, like we've talked about before on this podcast, it's deeply intertwining technology and geopolitics. It maybe perhaps is a bit of a clarion call to scrutinize the origins and the control mechanisms behind models. But I think it's pretty tough to have OpenAI doing that, calling that as well. And I think that It's a pretty interesting thing because, you know, obviously national security is at stake, and I'm not surprised by it at all. Like I of course, to me, it's a pretty obvious thing that they're doing, and they also see it as a competitor. So of course they're calling it out because it's not easy, but it's an obvious land grab against a competitor to say like, look, we don't trust that origin, we don't trust the mechanisms behind it, and carving out some perhaps false but potentially impactful guardrails for themselves makes sense to me. I don't think it's anything new. What do you guys think?
I think it's kind of laughably stupid. I think it's open source model that can be interrogated, used, and shared widely. To say that it's state controlled is silly. Anyone can look at it, look at the weights, test it, and figure out if there's any real bias. And anyone can copy it, fork it, use it, whatever. OpenAI is also claiming like they stole our data. They distilled our model. I mean, OpenAI has stolen shitloads of data and content. So it's just really rich for OpenAI to be anti-open source, and and to be anti-copyright theft, and to be anti-competitive, um, and ask for closed markets, closed source, and closed competition. It just seems
Mhm.
hypocritical and silly and just brand damaging, and just focus on innovating and staying ahead of the curve.
I also think that this call of saying like state-sponsored AI is dangerous, as if like you're just gonna let's just assume for a second that that's what they're saying. State-sponsored AI is dangerous. Well, so is unchecked corporate AI monopolies.
Yeah. So what I was going to say, I know we were going to try to avoid discussing politics in this episode, but it seems like I'm going to break that rule because I think there's something really interesting going on here that speaks to the broader zeitgeist, right? Which is we're coming to the end of the post-World War II kind of US-led world order. And I think that era was such a long period that it was like in the oxygen, in the air. We didn't really realize what was happening, which is that the US has relied on these soft projections of power, right? Based on alliances, aid, trade deals, but also the export of technology that is, by the way, in many cases, state-sponsored and state-controlled, but it's okay because it's being done by the United States government. And the United States has been a relatively benevolent force, at least if you're part of that Western sphere. And so what's happening now is two things at the same time. One is that China is now using the same soft power tools that the US has used since the end of World War II to gain influence across the world. And we don't like that because suddenly we realize that, oh, okay, this might not be just a politically neutral, nice thing to do, but actually serves the goals of the country that is originating the technology. And at the exact same time, we've got the United States, for whatever reason, and I honestly can't understand why, renouncing that role, giving up on its soft power, breaking up old alliances, not interested in aid or influencing other countries. So we have this weird situation now, right? Where, yeah, of course, OpenAI is calling for DeepSeek to be banned, but China is doing what the US has been doing all of this time. And, sitting here in a neutral third country that was very much within the US sphere of influence. And Ellie, I know you're Canadian and Australian, so you've got a double. We were talking before we started recording about the whole elbows up movement in Canada and the amount of rage there is towards the United States there. Sitting here as a non-American, I'm like, well, yes, DeepSeek is arguably state-sponsored and state-controlled. It's arguable, but then so is OpenAI. It's just a different state, and it's not clear to me that one of them is more benevolent than the other right now, and that's a real shift.
That's the biggest problem, is that it's not clear to you or to anyone else which one is better than the other.
That's my point.
So we've gone from this world that's the most dangerous part of it, is that it's all just the same, right? Like Russia, as Trump likes to say, well, Russia's killed people, we've killed people, they've killed people, we've done that, they've invaded people, we've invaded people. He's created a moral equivalence between Russia's actions and the US's actions, and so is literally Kremlin talking points, right? It's like US is no better than Russia, and so now there's this general malaise of like, well, we're not really sure who the good guys are, And on one hand, that's right. That like the US is not or have always been the good guy, and the you know that's worth interrogating. But on the other hand, if no one's even trying to be the good guy, well, we're now just back to raw power makes right. Um, and if you talk about soft power, I don't know if some people understand what soft power means. Like, it's certainly a vast majority of the US doesn't seem to know what soft power means. We're talking about brand. The USA. What does it stand for? We're talking about narrative, right? Hollywood movies that put the US as the hero of the story of building context for war and consent for war and coalitions for war. We're talking about economics, right? Economic ties. We're talking about aid as foreign policy. We're talking about alliances, explicit agreements, and we're talking about, of course, hard power like the military-industrial complex and bases all around the world. And this is a power structure, a power stack that is being rapidly, rapidly and systematically dismantled, and it makes no sense, none, unless
Mhm.
the guy is like a Russian agent. There's no upside argument for this.
What guy, Chris?
We can only guess.
We're not saying the T word, are we? He who shall not be named.
Yeah, but this is the thing when you talk about like, well, OpenAI is state sponsored in a way and state controlled. Yeah, but we would never have thought in those terms. I think even 5 years ago.
Yeah, that's my point. Yeah. There's that old joke, Chris, where, there's two young fish swimming in the ocean, and the older fish comes up to them and says, "Hey, boys, how's the water today?" And the two fish look at each other and say, "What's water?" Right? So the point is, it was so ubiquitous, they didn't even realize it was there. And I think that is what US power has been like for all of our lives. And the fact that that's ending is very disorienting.
It
Yeah.
sure is. I mean, I think what's pretty interesting is that um, this is not surprising in terms of China. Like they've been at this for quite some time. It's just that no one was looking or noticing. Like I've been, thinking about the Belt and Road Initiative. Like they've been doing this. They've been actively working on soft power for quite some time. And if the US isn't there in these places around the world, of course, we know who will be. And it is pretty interesting that the US is pulling back. I also think this is a pretty interesting moment in time when technology and the tools that have been developed. I mean, it's not new for technology to have initially been developed for defense systems first and then be commercialized into both enterprise and consumer products, like we know, obviously, Wi-Fi, GPS, all of these things that we use absolutely every day were initially.
The internet itself.
Yes, the internet itself was initially developed for, defense purposes. And so all of these things, like that's not new by any means. But I think what is in some ways new is the overt nature in which technology is being or might be or is, yes, if not already is a part of the war efforts. So there's different types of war, right? There's economic war, there's currency wars, there's cyber, there's technology, and then of course there's, God forbid, gun wars. But I think that it is pretty interesting to see how technology right now, being either a leader or a laggard, depending on what nation you are, is actively becoming a part of these geopolitical conflicts. And it is a pretty interesting question because I think there are a lot of innovators in technology who don't want it to be and don't want to be a part of that. But I don't know if it's a choice.
This reminds me of two things, actually. So you mentioned China has been doing this for a long time, and yes, China has been, they think on longer time horizon of 100 years, not 4-year election cycles or even 2-year thing until you have to run again, right? And so, yeah, China's been methodically and effectively building their soft influence for years and years and years. The thing that's changed now is that the US has got itself in the face. Like, there's one thing for China to be competing, it's another for the US to go, we give up. Or worse, we're gonna just poke everybody in the eye and unwind things. So that seems shockingly bad to me. As you were talking, it reminded me of Anduril as well, which is the Palmer Luckey company, the guy who founded Oculus VR, young guy. who got fired from Facebook for some nonsense, and he went and started a defense company. And what's interesting about his thing is, speaking of Silicon Valley culture, Silicon Valley's culture was like, we don't get involved in defense tech. That's dirty, disgusting stuff. We're not. That's amoral or immoral. We don't want to do that. And Palmer Luckey was like, no, no, fuck that. We should contribute to U.S. defense. We should be part of that conversation. We can help. And then the other thing that's different about Anduril is where there's most defense companies are defense contractors. So they're the vaunted technology-backed services company, and if they get the requirements from the government and they go build something. Anduril is like, no, 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 no. We're a Silicon Valley style product company. We build products, you buy them off the shelf. And so they're building incredible, incredible products at a pace that's never been seen before. And they're selling them to the US and all sorts of that, and the allies and all sorts of stuff. They're obviously export controlled. I mean, our friend of the pod, Emil Michael, is head of DoD R&D or whatever, just defense spending. I'm sure he's going to be buying a lot of Anduril, right? And so on one hand, the US is going to get the kind of the defense tech is going to get modernized, while soft power is going to get dismantled. So that's an interesting and dangerous mix of drones and cutting edge AI powered weapons floating around, and aid and
Mhm.
alliances get eroded or dismantled.
Let me attempt a little segue here. Not the best one ever, but we're talking about AI-powered drones, and I wanted to bring us to our next topic, which is to talk about robotics. That's been a recurring topic on this show lately, and that's because it really does feel like 2025 is the year that robots go from science fiction. And when I talk about robots, I'm talking about fully mobile humanoid-style robots, as opposed to factory robots or robot vacuum cleaners or whatnot. And there have been a couple of announcements in the past week that I think really speak to that. So about a week ago, Google announced something called Gemini Robotics, and that is their foundation model, and I think a bit of infrastructure as well, designed specifically for robotics. So we have a big player now who is actually leaning into the software side of robotics. And Chris, you and I have been talking about the fact that the software and the hardware seem to be reaching maturity at a similar time, and so that's why we really have this moment in history. And then I saw just today, NVIDIA is making a bunch of announcements at a conference, and they have debuted something called Groot N1. Groot is a strange name, which they're calling a foundational model for humanoid robotics, right? So again, NVIDIA, interestingly, have been getting into the foundation model game for the last 6 to 12 months. And this is not the only foundational model that they announced, but I think it's really interesting that it is tuned for robotics. And one of the interesting things is that the architecture of the model has these two thought modes, a sort of a rapid response fast mode and a more thoughtful logical slow mode. And for those who are fans of the book Thinking Fast and Slow, I believe that was Daniel Kahneman, and this idea that the human mind works in this way, that it has this sort of very fast pattern matching side of things that allows us to be quick and to preserve energy and cognitive effort. And then we have this slow mode, where we think things through and we're more logical and more methodical. And I think it's fascinating that as we're building out models for robotics, it's actually drawing inspiration from the way that humans think. But I think it's just a really, really interesting time to be alive.
Yeah, so Groot is not new. Groot's been around for a little while, but I think they've announced some new versions and new iterations on that. And so when I talk about being super bullish on NVIDIA, Groot is definitely part of the story for me. And they roll out these whatever 15 robots on stage, and there's a lot of people that are investing in using Groot, using NVIDIA tech. The one that I followed more closely was the Google Robotics announcement, and here's some takeaways for people who haven't seen that. They've focused on three key tenets: that it has to be interactive, which means that if you ask it to put some strawberries in a container and you start moving the container around, the robot needs to be able to recalculate quickly and kind of follow the container and figure out the changing circumstances. It needs to be dexterous. They had these two little pincer hands that were able to fold origami. That was incredible. And that it needs to be generalized to any task, basically, from sorting strawberries to folding laundry to picking up the kids. And they said that needs to do that across multiple physical forms. So anything from two little pincer hands to full, a bipedal robot to rolling robots to what have you. And they're, claiming at least that's their goal, and that they've built a vision language action model. They call it vision language action model to do all three things across multiple physical forms. For me, this says two or three things. Yes, the time of robotics is here. Yes, NVIDIA and Google are going to be huge players in this. Um, I think this further demonstrates that Tesla is a joke at this point. Optimus is like little more than a tech demo. I think they're way behind. Let's see if they prove me wrong. And for me, I don't know how you look at these things, and this is not financial advice, but I just don't know how you don't dump most of your money in the Magnificent Seven. I think, between Google and Amazon and whatever, they're just gonna, and NVIDIA, they're just gonna consume all intellectual and physical labor. And so I think it's huge. This is just the size of this business can dwarf entire economies. And I think it's just very, very exciting. And so I can't wait. I can't wait to see what comes from this.
It is super exciting. I mean, I think it does seems like it's this perfect moment of aligning all these things that we've actually been, all these disparate tracks that you've seen sort of progressing for so long. Like, the dexterous thing. I mean, we've seen in medical innovation, we've seen surgeons being able to use these types of tools for remote surgery for some time at like incredible precision and with incredible clarity and execution at that. So we know that has existed. And then now with this sort of alignment of AI models being able to process unstructured data and consume the world around. And, you see these things sort of coming together in a way that really makes sense. That's going to be it could be pretty world changing. And think in the past, we've talked about different modalities and sort of wearable devices and sort of what that interface looks like when the products that we have in our everyday lives are consuming the world around us and then becoming supportive assistants to us, agents and assistants to us in our everyday lives. And I think we're just really seeing the foundational building blocks for what that's going to be pretty soon, which is, I think, very, very exciting. I do think it's a little bit ironic that it's the same week that we also, I don't know if you guys saw the news that iRobot announced that it was probably going to go bankrupt. So
Oh,
there
really?
was also that news that our Roombas, yes, that the Roombas might be bricked. So there's, it is kind of interesting that one of the very first home robots that we ever saw come into, I would say, like, pretty widespread adoption. I think it was one of the very first.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there's not confirmed yet, but they did make that announcement earlier this week.
I didn't catch that announcement. I'm actually kind of blown away by that. And as robotics, consumer robotics is about to take off, for iRobot to be failing I think that's just that is massive mismanagement combined with huge competitive forces from China, right? The Roboroks and the Oppos or whatever they're coming out of China. There's a whole suite of these things that are smarter, faster, better, cheaper, more innovative. Yeah, I've been buying iRobot Roombas for I don't know how long, 15 years. One of the first ones I bought,
Same,
which just bounced around my apartment doing nothing and eating cables.
same,
And the latest one that I purchased, I ended up buying a Roborock because I was like, oh, this one is like a
same,
really? There you go. Yeah, and I think that's just
same journey.
Team Roborock.
they didn't keep up.
Speaking of Chinese espionage and soft power, it's
Yes.
funny to think that we have a little LiDAR-enabled device mapping the insides of our homes and probably sending all of that information back to some servers in China. And you know what? I am there for it because it is incredibly convenient.
Well, I mean, just let's take a little side journey here to take that point very seriously. While we talk about LLMs and we talk about TikTok, because it seems like the US government is fucking stupid. We're not talking about DJI drones and Roborocks and network infrastructure that is indexing the digital world, the interior world, and the exterior world for China all the time. I mean, it's just the kind of the lack of complete awareness of the battlefield is a bit laughable.
I think it is pretty interesting. Just to go on a personal journey with this. Like you, Chris, I was one of the first, like, really brought on iRobot, Roomba, like, yeah, probably a decade ago. Survived through multiple iterations of it. Finally made the leap to the Roborock last year. Love it. And kind of interestingly, we've also traded in our Tesla for a BYD Shark. So it is pretty compelling to see this incredible Chinese tech that's just coming up to the quality. I mean, the quality of the tech has always been there, but I think from, I say this as a consumer, sort of as a designer by trade and as kind of a consumer investor as well. Chinese tech hasn't in the past met the consumer expectations of the Western market, and they understand that, and now they are in a lot of different products, and they're building vehicles that feel luxury, electric vehicles that feel luxury, and they are growing at a pace and a scale that it is absolutely wild. As a consumer, we said, hey, well, actually, the BYD Shark is pretty great. We can't get a Rivian here in Australia, although I would have loved to get a Rivian, to be honest. But that was the decision that we made, that was like, this is a fabulous vehicle. And I think, I think it's a pretty interesting time to see consumer adoption moving so strongly. But yeah, while we were sitting here, I did look up Amazon's bid for iRobot fell through in January. They made their SEC filing on Wednesday this week and reported a 44% drop in revenue and issued a warning that, they could be out of business within 12 months. So
yeah, iRobot, it's like they're the AOL of robot vacuum cleaners. They haven't kept up. But yeah, actually, just a very quick side note to our side note. You mentioned BYD versus Tesla, right? I know we have a bunch of listeners in the US where BYD doesn't really trade because of tariffs. And so it's a fascinating thing for those outside of the US. There is really no reason to buy a Tesla, even if you don't have a problem with Elon Musk. Like, the whole Elon Musk thing has definitely been weighing on Tesla sales. But the truth is, you get into a BYD, it is the same level of good, often better, for half the price. And people just vote with their wallets. It's the same way that, every other bit of consumer electronics is now made in China because it's cheaper and better, right? You don't think, oh, I want to get a TV that's made in the USA or made in Japan. They're all made in China. Well, electric cars that transition to EVs have transitioned them into electronic appliances, and that is where China shines. So BYDs are really pretty incredible at every price point at which they operate.
And, it is not just Chinese tech. I mean, like, I think we're at the point now where the competitive, in terms of EVs, the Kia EV6, the Kia EV9, and EV5, those cars, they've caught up. I think we're looking at the Polestar, the Polestar 4 that's just been released. That's a pretty incredible EV competitor. And so I think there's obviously sort of a perfect storm when it comes to Tesla of a particular reaction to Elon Musk, sure, but also viable competitors in viable price points across the market that are being made available elsewhere.
Yeah, Rivians are very popular in Silicon Valley now. There's a lot of Rivians around, especially given how small they are and boutique they are. There's a lot. I went to China, I want to say 7, 8, 9 years ago, before the Hong Kong riots. It's difficult to explain how many people with how much enthusiasm and momentum and seriousness of purpose there are in China. There's more billionaires in China than whatever people in the US or something. I don't know. And so it's,
You heard that here first.
no, I think that's actually true. There's some stat.
Well, there's 300 million billionaires in China.
I don't know what the stat is, but
You said there's more billionaires in China than people in the US.
it might be there more millionaires in China than people in the US. So there is actually some stat like that which blows your mind. I don't remember what the stat is, but sheer force of will, brute force, low labor costs, which there's plenty to say about that, the ethics of that, and on and on. Yeah, it is a freight train, and as we said, 2 topics ago, that's without the US shooting itself in the face. One of my favorite nerdy TV shows from years back is Firefly. And one of the characteristics of that fictional universe is that everybody can speak Chinese and English, because the backstory is that there was this China Anglo merging. There's a big giant merging of cultures, and that seemed inevitable even 15 some years ago. Yeah, this is This is I think that's the future. We're all going to be speaking English and Chinese or Mandarin. My kid is in a Mandarin immersion school for that reason. And yeah, that's the geopolitics are going to be completely different in a few years.
Could be. Over 7,000 global companies like Atlassian, Dovetail, FlowHealth, and Quora all use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. Why aren't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off. I wanted to move on to the final topic that we've got on the slate, which is a trend corner that I put here, which is AI and the great race to unify your company's data. And this sort of came to me a couple of months ago. We had Shishir Mehrotra, the founder of Coda and now the CEO of Grammarly, on the show to talk about his vision for the future of AI. And it was very much about the idea that Coda and Grammarly together allow all the different sources of data, the Coda connectors, to sort of go into one big place where AI can make sense of that global context for your company. And then earlier this week, I spoke to the founder of a company called DevRev, potential future guest on this show, which is actually doing something quite similar, right? Which is, they call it conversational AI for your business. And a big part of their secret sauce is actually this sort of integration platform where all the different bits of data, your Salesforce, your Notion, your Jira, everything in your company kind of gets slurped into this, I guess, AI data lake. And then the AI can make sense of it all, can join the dots and can give you really powerful analytics, really powerful customer support, really powerful this and that. And, then I've spoken to other startups who have got these really great ideas, but they're also predicated ultimately on having access to all of a company's data. And so I'm actually seeing this as a bit of a land grab or an oil rush where most B2B companies, most SaaS companies are ultimately going to need to rely on this substrate of data. And so that is the prize. The company that can kind of unify the data at the most companies and own that end to end is going to be the big winner. And ultimately, I imagine these will become platform companies. They will allow other startups to build on top of them, but they will be able to extract a majority of the value, a majority of the rent from this transition. And so, when you see all of these companies that are building products that look like they kind of do a lot of different things, actually, shout back to Rippling and Deel, whatever is going on with their corporate skullduggery, they're also in the game of building these bundles of unified products so that they have access to as much data about your company as possible. That seems to be the game now. It is not the SaaS, it's not the vertical niche, it's the unification of data and then enabling AI to do all sorts of different things with that data. So that's my observation. I was just interested in your two reactions.
It's super exciting because, I see it not just within organizations and the sort of operational efficiency, but it's the operational efficiency of going to, outside industries from tech that have historically been islands away from tech, SMBs in potentially non-tech enabled or non-tech optimized industries that are really sitting on gold mines of data. And the reason it hasn't really been usable in the past is just because it's unstructured. And now we do have these systems that can process unstructured data and generate actionable insights and optimize like really, really cool, simple things like, thinking about an industrial SMB in Middle America that can find customers in a way that they've never found before because they can process all of their historical customer records through systems and cross-reference who else is buying in their region outside data systems and then generate a new predictive list of customer leads. Like it's that kind of like really get kind of tactical about like what that actually means. That's a huge thing for not just big tech companies. And it's pretty exciting, I think. And, in terms of this land grab of how it's actually going to be built, we actually are super excited about this as a fund and as investors. We've backed an incredible team that is, building a tool that's very similar to that for, project and program management. Taking in all of your sources from everything from Slack to Jira to emails to your team text messages, as well as your OKRs, and actually building out prioritized systems for different team members and teammates to actually know what to work on, know what they're blocking in a way that humans don't need to do that anymore. Because, as we know, humans need to sleep. We miss meetings. There's context errors, and AI doesn't have that. And so I think it's, a really incredible tool. I think the question from, an organizational system standpoint is definitely, obviously, the blocker is always going to be privacy. I think we know that CEOs love the idea. Privacy teams are probably screaming. And those are the types of the challenges that we're going to have to get through and work through. But at the end of the day, any of your company and work emails, like we talked about earlier, any of your Slack messages, all of that's owned by company anyways.
Yeah, I mean, AI is a powerful mediating layer of everything, right? It's going to be the primary interface for everything, everywhere, all at once. Like you said, Ellie, the reason this becomes much easier now is because uh, AI can deal with unstructured data. The hardest thing was to normalize, dedupe, and structure all this data. And now it's like, oh, you don't need to do any of that shit. Just put it all in one place. It's fine. The AI will figure it out. For the longest time, I've been really passionate about data portability. For this reason, I think it's safe to take credit for popularizing that phrase with the data portability project and pushing for some of the data projects that got popular. I think for exactly this reason, this idea that your data uh, repurposed or gathered into some kind of data pool, data lake, vault is very, very powerful, and you can apply all sorts of applications over the top. For me, I'm much more interested in the consumer side of this than the enterprise side of this. I think there's a massive, massive opportunity for some startup somewhere to create some personal data vault with really granular permissioning and what have you, kind of like this generalized super RAG. um, and I think you combine a generalized super RAG with a generalized super agent that can itself grant partial access to your super RAG to other agents for the purposes of executing operational tasks is a pretty damn exciting combination of things. And so you know, if it's a startup I'd like to work on, it'd be that.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think there's a real opportunity there because Apple doesn't have all your data. They're going to have to ask you to connect to things. Google doesn't have all your data, although that may be a little bit more, but they're going to have to ask you to connect to things. Microsoft doesn't have all your data. OpenAI doesn't have all your data, and certainly as a startup, you don't have access to all your data. There's going to need to be a virtual third party, a neutral third party, not necessarily neutral, but there's going to be some parties that are going to need to be very good at aggregating and normalizing this data and then making it accessible to agents on demand.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Chris, I feel like we talked about this almost a year ago, and almost a year ago, like to the maybe couple weeks off. But we talked about the potential of this. I think I was circling around that exact thought as well about how exciting it is as like building your own personal agent, and the fact that if you plug in all of these sources, the way that it can support you is amazing. I think it is pretty mind blowing that you say Google doesn't have all your data or Apple doesn't have all your data. They have a lot though. And they can do a lot with what they do have. Like, I think what's pretty interesting is that those sort of single sources of data of your own personal history. Let's say I have had my iCloud account for 20 years, 20 years for sure, That's a lot of text message data. That's a lot of family photos. That's a lot of unstructured data that can, think about what I mean, I'm sure there are many listeners out there like myself that have iCloud, history that would love to have it structured and organized by an AI that, it's like safe because it's only within your own system. And then similarly with Google, like I've been on Google, Gmail for, decades. I've been writing professional emails on there for decades. There's no reason why an AI assistant in Google, in your Gemini email writing assistant, shouldn't be able to match your tone of voice or the way that you speak or write. And they haven't yet because they are up against those privacy concerns. And so it does seem like it's some pretty open playing field for a third party application to be able to plug in all of those systems and actually process it because you're just giving it permission to do so.
I actually want to take it back a little bit because Apple and maybe Android, Google through Android has your data through the apps. right? So with Siri search and Siri APIs and app intents and all this kind of stuff,
That's right.
there's no reason why a client-side Siri AI can't access your entire universe of data through your universe of apps. Um, eh, you know, so I think there's a really interesting advantage they have there. But yeah, I still think because of Apple's privacy obsession and their contract with their users, they can't kind of like synchronize and aggregate and host that in the cloud to then give it to other agents. So if you ask Siri, hey, can you book me a flight? Um, it's difficult for Siri to grant access to parts of your data to the flight booking agent. Maybe it can do it through some kind of conversational interface. So the flight booking system doesn't have access to your data. It only gets to ask your Siri questions or something. But to the degree that there needs to be a fit for purpose, cloud-based, granular permissioning personal RAG, I don't think Apple can do that because of their privacy obsession. Google maybe, but I think there is an opportunity for a Switzerland third party and maybe an open protocol to make this real.
There's no reason that it shouldn't exist in very short order. Absolutely. I personally would love it.
I think that's a good place to wrap. Lots of fun conversations there, folks. If you have thoughts on any of these topics, please leave them in the comments. We'd love to engage and start the discussion there. We have comments on Spotify, comments on YouTube. We check them regularly. All right, Ellie, if people want to catch up with you and what you're doing, learn more about you, where's the best place for them to go?
You can find me on LinkedIn. I am pretty active there. So my name's Ellie Hansen. Come and follow me on LinkedIn.
Yeah, I'm on all the social media at Chris Sard and on my website, chrissard.com and chrissard.com/newsletter.
And I'm on LinkedIn trying to make it a little bit less boring. I love getting connection requests from TSP listeners. Just got one yesterday who said they finally worked up the courage. Please, I'm a very lovely, approachable guy. So please just send me a connection request and I'd love to have you as part of my network. Thanks for joining us on Startup Podcast Reacts for this week. Chris, wonderful as always. Have a good one.
All right, see you later.
Thanks, guys.
Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. Over 7,000 global companies already use Vanta. Why don't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.